It's Cade, and I made a mistake reading these books. I read The Slob, and then I read The Son of the Slob, and I think it affected me mentally. So if you don't know, I've decided leading up to Halloween, I'm going to spend the whole month of October reading horror books. And I thought a fun video idea would be reading extreme horror. I'm not having fun anymore. I really kind of regret doing this. I don't know why I thought that it would be fun to sit down and subject myself to hours and hours of torture by trying to get through these books. And that's not me being hyperbolic or anything. It was a legitimate form of torture, in my opinion. So before we get into me actually talking about the books and the review and everything, let's just go over a summary of both of these books. Again, I read The Slob and The Son of the Slob. I read these back to back, so I didn't take a week off or anything. I read them both over the course of 3 days. So I was only reading extreme horror for 3 days, and I think it legitimately affected my psyche. All that to say, if you're the type of person that sits down and reads this stuff for fun, I think you might have problems. And I think just reading these two books, I might have included myself in the group of people with problems. So before we get into my actual review of the books and everything, let's go over a quick summary of The Slob and The Son of the Slob. I'm going to do a summary of both of these back to back. If you've already read the books or you're just not interested, you can skip using the time codes to the actual review. So for the main book, The Slob, our protagonist of the story is Vera. She's a woman who grew up in kind of an abusive home, I would say, or maybe more of a toxic home that was just riddled with trash. Her sister had bipolar disorder, and that mixed with her alcoholism made her very violent. So Vera's childhood was very turbulent and tough. So her family's very poor, they don't have good hygiene at all, and this kind of leads to a bunch of issues. But ultimately, Vera's sister with bipolar disorder ends up taking her own life, and Vera is made to clean up the remains of her sister since the family can't afford to get a professional cleaning service to do it. And this part is really graphic because the coroner had taken the body away and everything, but Vera describes finding an eyeball in the vent and kind of just having to try and fail ultimately to get this disgusting red gunk out of the carpet. So Vera kind of becomes obsessed with cleaning as a way to change her destiny, I guess, and that kind of continues into adulthood. She's a very clean adult. She meets her husband Daniel, who is a Vietnam veteran who was paralyzed in Nam and lost the use of his lower half, so he's in a wheelchair. So Vera as an adult is working as a hotel maid, and Daniel, her husband, is a wounded veteran, so he's receiving disability from the government, and we hear that this kind of keeps them afloat. They're living a pretty decent life. Their house is very clean because Vera's kind of obsessed with cleaning now. So a salesman, a door-to-door salesman, comes to their front door and pitches Vera the idea of buying a Bissell wet vac. It's maybe kind of like this one. My wife made me buy this for her. So he gives her a demonstration of the vacuum on a corner of carpet in their house, and she's just ecstatic about this. She's like, oh, I can finally clean even the carpets really good, because of course she had to clean the carpets after her sister's incident. She buys it. She also gets a business card from the salesman. We later find out that she wants to go door to door selling these because, as she tells Daniel, it's such a good product it basically sells itself. Daniel isn't on board with this idea because he's like, you're going to be going into strangers' houses and giving them demonstrations and stuff, and you're pregnant as well. So I'd rather not have my pregnant wife out knocking doors and having to walk far distances every day. They're in a disagreement about this, but ultimately Vera ends up getting her way. she agrees to do it for a short amount of time. Vera's very good at this. She's selling a ton of vacuums. She's making really good money doing it while also working as a hotel maid still. She reaches the end of the time that she promised Daniel that she would do it, and on I think it's basically the very last day, she tells him, okay, I'm gonna go try to get a couple more sales because then I can get a bonus that would get me an extra $40. As a result of that, she has to go kind of outside the city limits a little further than she's used to because she's already hit most of the doors in the city. She goes down this rural back road and knocks on the door of a house that has bars outside the windows and just generally looks kind of decrepit. And a man answers who is a slob. She thinks of him in her head as a slob. He's described as basically the grossest person you could imagine. Long, unkempt hair with kind of a bald spot in the middle. Extremely overweight and unhygienic. His teeth are black and yellow. And he's got rot on his foot and stuff. And his fingernails and toenails are just destroyed. But wanting to make the sale, she ignores it. And trying to be polite, she goes into the house to clean up an area. She goes upstairs past this disgusting description of stairs that are carpeted but they're black with gunk. She goes into a bedroom where once she turns the corner, there's a pile of body parts on the carpet and the slob just kind of says clean. And the whole thing transpires. Ultimately, the slob ends up kind of getting upset with her and knocking her out with a kick to the head, I believe it was. She wakes up, there's a lady in the room with her with a bag over her head. Later on in the story, she removes the bag from the lady's head, and the lady has no lips and has been, I think, just scalped, but maybe it was that her whole face had been kind of skinned and degloved. They devise a plan to get out of there. The plan goes horribly wrong. This other girl that's with Vera in there ultimately gone. She's out of the story. You know what happens. More series of things unravels. Vera ends up in a barn beside the property where there are just piles of corpses. Vera ultimately gets the key from the slob and grinds him up in a grinder that he was using for humans. At the end of the story, we see that there was another man involved in this whole thing when he brings back another girl to the farm, and he sees that the slob has died, so he kills the girl, torches the farm, goes back to a mansion where we learn that it was kind of like a group of people that was doing this whole thing, and they were packaging the women that the slob and these other people got as, they were packaging them as TYG, which stands for Tender Young Girl. A Japanese businessman comes to try this TYG. They don't have any because of the whole incident at the farm, and he ends up all of them. And that's the first book. That's the slob. Now let's summarize the son of the slob. This is incredibly hard to summarize because so much of it is so brutal that I don't even think I can say most of it on YouTube. But what I didn't mention before, that I will mention before I get into the summary for Son of the Slob, is Vera's pregnant in the first book. The slob basically undoes that and kind of wreaks havoc on her. And at the end of the book, we find out that Vera is pregnant again with the son of the slob. That leads into this book. So the son of the slob begins. We see that Vera's face is incredibly disfigured still. She loses her job at the Hilton, which she was a maid at before. She says because of her face, and that's kind of what's implied in the story. She now works at a seedy motel, and despite being in therapy, her and Daniel basically have stopped talking entirely. She decided to keep the baby that the slob put inside her, and it is now around 8 years old, and his name is Harold, and he's a spitting image of his father. He has the long, unkempt hair. He's big and nasty with like sores on his face. His teeth from birth were black and yellow, and he's just kind of generally disgusting. And they say he has like a mental impairment, so he doesn't really talk. He's kind of not all there. One time when they're going to couples counseling, they leave Harold with a babysitter, and he eats the ashes of the babysitter's grandmother. And that's kind of the inciting incident for the story, where everything really starts to go downhill from there. So at the hotel, there's an incident that takes place where two people are offed, and Vera has to kind of clean up the mess again. After this violent incident at the motel, a woman comes back to get something that she left there, and it's a bag of crystal. I don't know what I can say on YouTube, so I'm just going to call it crystal. But it's a big bag of that, and a detective shows up at the door, and ultimately the girl whose name is Tina ends up slipping out of a back window and getting away. A while later, Vera comes home, and Daniel is gone. He went to stay with a friend because he feels like the situation with her and him is just completely unsalvageable, and he really resents Harold, and he kind of resents Vera as a side effect for keeping the baby. Now that nobody's home to watch Harold while she's gone, Vera has to bring Harold to the motel and lock him in room 13, which is the room where the violent crime happened. So Harold's in that room watching Ren and Stimpy. So what I didn't say before was, while all this was transpiring with Vera, Daniel, and Harold, Tina's having her own little side story where she gets this bag of crystal. She hits up a friend of hers to go and sell it with her. And this guy is HIV positive, we're told. So they go to sell this stuff. They run into the guy that was originally peddling it. And he's like, I can't let them step over my territory. He offs the friend of hers. And Tina is kind of strapped down or held down. The guy takes a syringe and takes blood of the friend who is HIV positive, injects it into Tina's eyeball to show her, like, you don't walk all over me like this. This is my territory. And lets her go. Tina's distraught with this. She's going back to the hotel to off herself as well. She gets there. She climbs in through a window. Harold gets into the bag of crystal because Harold's being kept in room 13, which is the same room that Tina went into. Harold does crystal while Tina's knocked out from trying to get into the window and falling on her head. Carves up Tina is the best way I can say it. Vera comes back, finds this whole situation, is distraught, but notices that Harold has crystal all over him. So she kind of doesn't blame him and says, oh, like she made him do this to her. She hacks up Tina even more, puts her into bags, brings her back to the house, is like, well, I'm going to dispose of her later. More events ensue. The next important thing is kind of that Harold goes to a Catholic school for his special needs classes because that's the only one that they could afford since it was free. And Harold is being abused at that school. I'm not going to get into it because it's really vile and despicable, but Harold is being abused. Ultimately, during one of these times that Harold is being abused, he's left alone with a nun while Vera is told to come pick him up after school for detention. And he suffocates the nun. And this lady was evil, by the way. It's not like this is a good nun. This is an evil one. He suffocates her and does all sort of bad stuff. Vera finds it, but she also finds pictures of Harold being abused. So once again, she hacks up the pieces, puts them in a trash bag, takes them home, leaves them in the basement along with Tina's to be disposed of later. At the same time, Daniel decides to come back and rejoin the family because he's had a change of heart. Once Daniel gets back, Vera's gone at work, but she locked up Harold in his bedroom that has an exterior bolt on it so that Harold couldn't get out because she's kind of scared of Harold now too. Daniel decides he's going to clean up and show Vera like, hey, life is going to be different. He decides to start with Harold's room. He goes into Harold's room. Harold's playing with his own excrement. Harold puts a bag over his head, offs Daniel. Vera comes home, finds Daniel propped up at the kitchen table with a bag over his head, and she knows that Harold did it. She ultimately now is like, Harold has taken everything from me. I have to get Harold. She gets a knife to get Harold. The detectives that had talked to her about the violent crime at the motel had been following her, come in. She's got a knife as she's about to stab Harold in the face, and boom! Vera's gone. Vera's last act is reaching out to Daniel and telling her that she loves him, even though he's gone. So the detectives go through the whole property and they think that this was just all the doing of Vera, because obviously nobody thinks that Harold, this little kid, did it. So they kind of blame her. Situation ensues where Harold ultimately ends up at a foster, like, orphanage place that's also evil. Everything in this universe is just evil. That's basically where we leave off with the Son of the Slob. I tried to make that as quick of a summary as I could, but there's a lot that you kind of need to know if you're going to hear my review of this. So that's the summary of kind of this entire series. So let's get into my kind of review and thoughts on the first book, The Slob. But before we do that, I just want to say I'm leaving out any talks of morals or anything. First of all, it's not really my place to lecture you on that, but also this book is kind of like inherently immoral. So if you need me to tell you that, like, hacking up girls into pieces is wrong, maybe just go and, like, hand yourself into the police station or something. So let me talk about the first Slob book. This book is like, I don't even know what to think about this kind of thing. Like, is this acceptable? This could have been like a 4-minute death metal song or something. You know, it's very reminiscent of old school Cannibal Corpse lyrics. If you know anything about like death metal or anything from that era, it's very like reminiscent of that. I wouldn't be surprised if the author Aron was big into that scene. So my first reflection on The Slob is just how gross and nasty it is. It's the kind of book that you read and you just feel unclean during and after you're reading. Literally, while I was reading this book one morning, I just put it down for a second because I was at a chapter break, and I got up and I just started cleaning. I took out some boxes that needed to be taken out, and I did some dishes that needed to be cleaned because I was just like, I just wanted to scrub myself with like steel wool because it was so gross. I was like, I feel like every fiber of my being needs a deep cleaning after reading this. The gunk and the disgust in these books is palpable, and it almost fills your nostrils while you're reading it. If you've ever been in any sort of like disgusting situation where you're in a house that's disgusting, a car that's disgusting, anything like that, it kind of just like comes flooding into your mind, all the smells and the disgust as you're reading this. And maybe if you haven't even been in those situations, it would, because the descriptive aspects of this book are kind of crazy. They're, I would say, good. I would say that's maybe the one part of this book that I can say is actually like well written, is the descriptions of the vileness and the just general filth. Overall, for the first book, I would say it's there. It's a book. It has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has an inciting incident and everything, and a conclusion. But just because it's a book doesn't make it a good book, and just because you can write something doesn't mean you should publish it for all the world to see. Just humor me real quick. Let's read a portion of the book, and let's see how much I have to censor out for YouTube. Here we go. This is from the first book again, The Slob. This is 78 pages in. A flock of pests prance around the vast field of never-trimmed some finding housing on beneath. He was all his like a wildly overinflated pink balloon on the verge of popping. He was unwell for many reasons, but it looked like due to the weight of his he was carrying a beanbag seating with him at all times. The elasticized was ready to rip and let the soup run free. I would not have been surprised to learn that he had elephantitis. I can't say anything from this book. My wife's sitting on the couch as I'm recording this, and she's like speechless. She's like, why did you even read this? Again, the only real good thing I can say about this book is it captures disgust very well and kind of evilness, I guess. I like Vera, the main character. I like her and Daniel's relationship. I kind of feel like this author, if he just wrote like a normal book, that he could kind of do all right, because all the normal stuff in this book, like the normalcy of their relationship, it's kind of sweet. She met him in like an AA meeting thing, and she kind of helped him and nursed him back to health a little bit and kind of gave him a reason for being and like a light in his life. And all that is established, and it's established pretty well, just to snuff it out and just to... It's like this. It's like you have a little glimmer of light here, and he shows you this light, and he says, look at it. See how nice that is? Isn't that nice? I don't know if you've ever seen A Series of Unfortunate Events or read the books, but this is a series of the worst unfortunate events that could possibly happen to anybody ever. Even just picturing these things in your mind while you're reading is like... I just had so many points I had to put the book down for a little bit. I just had to set it down and say I'm taking a break for like an hour. I really thought once I got in front of the camera that I would have more to say about the first book, but honestly, there's not a lot of substance to it, so there's not too much to go over beside the disgust. Like, I don't know how much I can just sit here and reiterate my disgust at this book. I would say... Ultimately, for the first book, it is a good ad for Bissell. Maybe actually not, because of some of the things that transpire with the Bissell product later in the book that I literally can't even say on YouTube. I would just get, like, wiped off the platform. And there's a couple, like, odd, like, little things in here. Like, she says after being knocked out by the slob... I don't recall exactly how many times he slammed my head, but it ached like a Robert Downey Jr. hangover. Which is just like an odd reference to Robert Downey Jr.'s past substance abuse problems. And it's like a very weird analogy for that. I should have counted it, but he uses the word secretions in this book too much. It was to the point where I was like, oh, okay, we're just like... inserting this word everywhere now. That's all I really have to say about the slob. Disgusting. If you're into that kind of thing, it's probably great. I'm not really a huge fan of it, but I didn't really regret reading it, honestly. It was kind of a read where you're like, oh my gosh, and you're just mind blown, so you get through it really fast because you're just like, how can this get worse? What's going on? Oh my gosh, is this gonna happen where it gets worse? Oh, okay, that's even worse than what I was imagining was gonna happen. So if you like extreme stuff like that, then it's good. I wouldn't say that it was really my favorite. Let's talk about The Son of the Slob, because this is where I have some real things to talk about. This book is all over the place. It jumps from narrative to narrative a lot, which is fine. I think it maybe was a little bit more jarring to me because the first book is basically entirely Vera's perspective. So when this one jumps from Harold to Vera to Daniel to Tina to all these other different characters and stuff, it's a little more jarring than the first book. And at the same time with this book, it feels like there was an attempt to top the first book. And instead of topping it in like filth, it tops it in evilness, I would say, because some of the things that happen in this book are just, it's just evil for evil's sake, and it's not really done out of a place of like commentary on anything. Not that the first book was, but this to like more of an extent. Some of the abuse that goes on with Harold and stuff is just like, you don't ever really want to like read about that. You don't want to like put that in your mind, I feel like, and you don't want to seek that out. And I really didn't want to. I would have stopped the book, I think, 30 pages in if I wasn't making this video. Since the book takes place 8 years after the first book, we don't see a lot of what's transpired in between, but we know that her and her husband Daniel have like grown apart, which is kind of another thing of just like any light in this world being snuffed out, because that's the only real thing in the first book that we have at the end is she comes home to Daniel and Daniel is there. After finishing the first one, in my head I want to be like, okay, this awful stuff happened, but Daniel is there and they're going to kind of get through it together. And then you read the second book and it's just like, oh, well, if you wanted to have any sort of positive moving forward after the first book, I'm gonna make sure that you don't get that in your head. Like, you don't get to even think that, because I'm gonna make it so awful that at the end of this book, there's literally nothing positive that you can think. You're just like, okay, everyone in this universe is depraved, evil, and vile, and disgusting, and evil, and evil, and evil. I think some of the reason that the second book affected me a lot more is it's a lot to do with Harold, and he's a child. He's like only like 8 years old or something in this book. And so then a lot of this stuff is more visceral because you're picturing this child in your head, even if he kind of comes from this depraved monster and this awful incident, you're still like, oh, this is like a child. But then even the little child in this universe is like the worst, most horrific monster that you could imagine. And he kind of does this thing where through Vera, our protagonist, we're given this idea of like, is it nature or is it nurture, right? And it's almost like he's trying to introduce this theme as like a, look, this is like something to think about with this. But then it's like, well, it's obviously just like nature in this book. If you skip the summary, there's an incident in the hotel when Harold does substances and he sees the slob, which is his father. The slob basically tells him to off this girl. So there's just like nothing sacred in this universe. If you read this book, you understand that a little more too. But there's nothing that's off limits to the author. There's no depth so dark that he won't go there. And on one hand, I would say that that is kind of an admirable thing in a certain light. The problem is that there's just no substance to it whatsoever. I think you can explore dark topics and everything in literature or art, but it's kind of just like, at a certain point, it just becomes disgusting and kind of vile. Where it's like, this isn't even like trying to say anything. This is just shock for shock's sake. And it's not that you can't do that. It's just that once I'm done reading it, I'm like, well, why did I read that? Like, did I just do that to just put like these gross ideas in my head of like these gross situations and like having to picture that stuff? Why did I do that? Yeah, it's just kind of like sadistic and reeks of sadism, you know. I really want to say more on these books, but I don't know what else I can say. I can only express my disgust and kind of tell you to avoid these if you're the type of person that is very affected by this, which I'm not normally the kind of person that like horror affects or anything, but I think especially the second book had way more of a detriment on my mind. So my desire in making videos is kind of to analyze something, right? And pick out like whatever the meaning of the text is. Not that I'm always the best at that, but with these books, there's nothing there. It's pointless. I guess that's really all I have to say. So if you're the type of person that this sounds intriguing to and you want to seek that out, by all means, feel free to. Do not come back and leave a dislike on the video because I didn't warn you though, because I did. Well, thank you for watching, guys. That's really all I have to say. I'm sorry I didn't have any exceptional analysis or anything, but there's not that much to this. If you like the video, subscribe. I'm going to be posting one more video about horror books around Halloween time. I'm going to be reading 3 or 4 more horror books before the end of the month. So if you're interested in that, subscribe. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. See ya.